When you stifle debate, and that has happened in Ireland, people become resentful and they become more extreme in their opinions.
Go back to their own country and do it.
Because if you keep on pushing somebody, eventually they're going to push back. It's a recipe for disaster. What we've seen is the farming out of refugees and asylum seekers.
There are rural towns in Ireland that have been overrun in one swoop, that have become a minority in one swoop.
All that's done is just sown distrust.
This is the issue through which they most keenly experience their dislocation from political life and their dislocation from democratic life.
It's got very ugly at times, and it always has the potential to get even more ugly. I'm worried about the future of my country.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Ian O'Doherty. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Brendan.
Great to have you back on. I feel like it hasn't been that long since our last chat, of course, which was about Ireland and all the stuff that's going on in Ireland. But so much is happening there all the time, and the world is increasingly interested in what's happening in Ireland as well. So I thought we should get you back on and find out what the hell is going on in this country that you and I both love, but are very worried about, I think it's fair to say. So to kick off, tell us, I guess, a broad question. What's the political temperature like in Ireland now? It felt quite tense for the past few years. Is it still tense? Are there still those unresolved problems? What's going on?
Immigration is still the third rail of Irish politics. And that's getting worse. It's not getting better. And every time there's a crime committed by a migrant, that's amplified by certain aspects of the media, and particularly on social media and stuff like that. And in many ways, the Irish have always been a very superstitious people, and they've been very much a binary people, that you're either good or you're bad. And you're either on the side of the angels or you're on the side of the devils. And in the immigration debate, which, despite the media and political bodies' best attempts to kind of suppress that debate, it really is the biggest issue in the country, and it has been the biggest issue in the country. I've been speaking to you about this for a couple of years now, and one of the problems that we created, and it is an entirely self-created problem, is that the media and academia and the political complex, if you refuse to kind of acknowledge it, and that just let myths and lies and rumours fester. And it allowed, or it fostered, what I would say now is occasionally a fairly toxic environment. And the Irish have gone from a people who, Céad Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes. We prided ourselves on being the most welcoming country in Europe. And that goes back into the Irish insecurity, because we're a small rock on the edge of a continent that doesn't really care about us. So we've always had this desire to be the best in the class. And in the last few years, there's been a real sea change in general attitudes. And you're always going to get a rump of bigots and racists wherever you are. I mean, that's, and you can just factor them in and then you can ignore them because, they're not serious people. But one of the main problems, I think, that the politicians in general and the media that they have created is that they sold a narrative that anybody who had any issues with immigration was automatically a bigot. And people resented that then, because, you can say, well, I don't think we should have open borders, but that doesn't make me a Nazi. And this has really been the third rail of Irish politics and Irish civil life for the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 5. And it's got very ugly at times. And it always has the potential to get even more ugly. I'm worried about the future of my country in terms of I always would have considered myself a sensible critic of unfettered, untrammeled immigration, for example. Every country has the right to control its own borders. That's not racist, and We're a small country, population of 4 million or so. You can't be taking in another 4 million people. You just can't, despite what a lot of the NGOs and the far left, the Open Borders Brigade say. That's just magical thinking. It simply doesn't work, and it's a recipe for disaster. But what I've found that does concern me is that some of the Irish openness and open-spiritedness seems to have dissipated in the last decade. And it's almost the immigrants or the immigration issue. But you see, just where I said the immigration issue, I was about to say the immigration problem.
Mm.
And this is one of those things that's quite interesting, is that, and you see it on RTE and TV3 and stuff, when people talk about immigration, they refer to the immigration problem as if it's automatically a problem. And it doesn't have to be, but it is an issue that can't be ignored. And I have found, and particularly in the last few years, that the immigrants themselves really aren't the lightning rod. They're just an excuse for both sides of Irish people to beat each other up. Because the right, the Conservatives, some of them are undoubtedly racist. There's no question about that. I mean, it's wrong to say that they're not. But a lot of them aren't. They just have legitimate criticisms. But they still seem to be more concerned about scoring points against the Open Borders Brigade. And the Open Borders Brigade, I'm talking about Antifa and a lot of the left wing, particularly their youth parties, who just want everybody in. I don't think that's motivated necessarily by a warm welcome for people fleeing from war and danger and trying to find a safe haven in Ireland. I think it's because they just want to stick it to the fascists, as they see it. This is not a very nuanced debate in this country. And we always have this problem that basically, a very Manichaean kind of worldview that you're either good or you're evil. And when you try to introduce any sense of nuance, and I've seen this in the UK as well. I mean, it's immigration particularly is one of those issues that will just get people up on their hind legs, and kind of normally rational people will just jump. Do you remember when we were kids, there was that TV kids quiz show called Run Around, where the kids in the studio had to jump into one particular circle when they thought they had the right answer?
Yeah.
And that's a very obscure reference to anybody who didn't grow up in the 70s and the 80s, but those of us who did will remember it. But in a weird way, sort of, society in the West in general, and Ireland in particular, has become a societal version of runaround, where an issue gets brought up and everybody runs to be in their particular spot.
Yeah.
And that removes any sense of nuance or colour. And everything just becomes this black and white thing. And apart from anything else, apart from being potentially dangerous, it's really dull. I mean, the Irish used to be known for their ability to have a good argument.
Yeah.
And, we'd argue until the cows come home. It was, we'd argue recreation for sport. But now there's a really nasty element on both sides, by the way. Yes, there are fascists in Ireland who, thankfully, they're so small in number that, we can laugh at them rather than fear them. But you have to acknowledge them, And then on the other side, with a lot of the Open Borders Brigades, they're just quite mad, and they've been brought up on an online diet of American social justice.
Yeah.
And the Antifa stuff and that. And so, bizarrely enough, what Ireland has found itself in is a situation where both sides, both the open borders, unfettered immigration, and the kind of right wing, and some of them are fascists. Let's be honest, some of them are fascists. A lot of them aren't, but some of them are. Ironically, they've imported foreign arguments themselves, and they've imported foreign positions themselves. This isn't the campus in Berkeley. This is meant to be a reasonably grown-up and mature country where we can discuss things rationally without screaming fascist at everybody. And, I mean, I remember I was doing a debate in Trinity a few years ago. And for your viewers, Trinity would be probably the most prestigious college. It's hundreds of years old. It's a very famous Irish university. And as somebody who didn't go to college, it was an honour to be asked to address the society there. And a bunch of the kids immediately stood up and started no free speech for fascists at me. And I just looked at them, I just started laughing because I was going, lads, I've been to countries where fascists were in power.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been to countries also where communists were in power before the fall of the wall. Romania, Russia, Yugoslavia. Trust me, I am not a fascist, and you don't want to meet them, you know. And it's become this very simplistic kind of debate. This is one of the things, and you know, the Irish always had a reputation for being good at arguing and being good at sort of debating issues. And we like a good row, we like a good argument. You shake hands and you have a beer afterwards, you know. It's like playing a football match where you kick 7 bells out of each other and then go for a pint, you know.
Yeah.
But we seem to be losing that capacity now. And now it's this, we're back into this kind of Manichaean good versus evil kind of thing. I've got lots of friends that I completely disagree with, and as I'm sure you do, as I'm sure anybody watching this does.
Mm.
And eventually you kind of come to an almost unspoken agreement that you're not going to touch the third rail of conversational issues that will get you having a row. Let's just talk about football. Let's just talk about music. Let's just talk about movies. Let's talk about the good things in life, you know, and let's have a beer or a coffee and remember why we liked each other and remember why we enjoy each other's company, rather than constantly sniping. And both sides, what they have as well is this unquenchable thirst for the moral high ground. So they don't want the opposition. And I see this in the UK and I see this in America as well. It's something that's really spread across the West a lot. But they don't want to have better arguments than the opposition. They just want to grind them into dust.
Yeah.
Because they don't see them as people with different opinions. They see them as evil. And that's no way to run a democracy. It's just stupid. That's actually, Brendan, I think that's probably one of the most salient points of a lot of this debate, is that a lot of it is just so bloody stupid.
Yeah. I think that's a very apt description of the feeling around immigration in Ireland at the moment. Because when I go to Ireland, usually out west in Connemara, where my family's from, it's the hottest topic. You know, people are really wound up about it. They're very angry about it. They're also angry about the fact that it feels difficult to have a rational discussion without being called a Nazi or something else. So it does get people really riled up. But I wanted to ask you, you know, to give our listeners a flavour of the developments that have taken place in Ireland in relation to the immigration question, because I think people sometimes struggle to understand how radical these shifts have been. You know, Ireland is traditionally a country that people left. It's not a country that people came to, but there has been a huge wave of immigration over the past few years. So what are we talking about, firstly, in relation to numbers, and then also say something about what's happening in the countryside? Because the thing that I find most alarming is that a lot of migrants have been sent out to small towns, small villages, put up in hotels, and that's causing a lot of tension in the country, isn't it?
It is. Well, the thing about it is, there are no vast metropolises in Ireland. You know, Cork, Dublin being the two biggest cities, but by a British standard, they're fairly small. You know, 1 million people in Dublin, that's it. What we've seen is the farming out of refugees and asylum seekers. And all that's done is just sown distrust. And we've seen IPAS centres, international protection centres, for refugee applicants. They're going into predominantly, majorly rural areas that are already underserved infrastructurally. And people already feel that they've been kind of left behind a bit by the Dublin government and that they're not being paid attention to. And then they see the one local hotel where they would have their weddings or their, you know, or their afters for the confirmations and the funerals, where they'd have all the major kind of life points would be in the local hotel. And then they've seen a lot, not all, but they've seen a lot of those hotels turn into basically refugee centres. And you, like, in one way, morally you can have a problem with the owners, but financially that makes sense because they're guaranteed full booking.
Yeah.
And they're guaranteed money coming in at the end of the month. So, I mean, it's a business is a business. But that was always going to stoke resentment. There was one case, I wrote about this a while ago, and I said, look, it's not racist if, as has happened on numerous documented and recorded occasions, where somebody would have booked their wedding for a year in advance and then to get a call 6 months before cancelling their wedding plans, cancelling the wedding reception on the night. And as I'm sure you know, the Irish like a good wedding, And I remember there was one fascinating debate, and I thought it said so much about Ireland. There was a lady rang in to a radio phone-in show on RTE, and she was complaining that her daughter's wedding had been cancelled. Now, this is going back a few years, and because they were turning it into an iPass centre or whatever, and so they gave the deposit had already been paid. They gave the deposit back, and so the woman was very hurt, and she wasn't a bigot. I mean, she wasn't delivering racial epithets or slurs or anything. She didn't really care about those people. She just cared about her daughter. It was looking forward to the biggest day of her life. And I thought what was really interesting was the furious reaction from callers, Irish callers, to that woman and her daughter. It was a real moment for me and for a lot of other people. Like, sometimes the biggest impacts can come from the smallest things. And this was a very small thing. This was just a woman ringing up about her daughter being upset. And it really created a national debate of people going, well, she's every right to be upset that the wedding she'd been looking forward to all her life or whatever had just been cancelled. And then other people were saying, well, tough, safe occupation for people fleeing persecution is more important than your bloody wedding. And that really showed a major cultural divide in Ireland. And it's one that I've seen in England as well.
Yeah.
And it tends to be between the people who aren't affected by this or the people who were affected, like, say, that young couple who were due to get married and then the wedding venue cancelled, gave the deposit back, all that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean you're a racist. It just means you're pissed off. Your wedding's been cancelled and now your plans have just been thrown up in the air, And I find it's very easy for a lot of the Irish left to sneer at either the working class, the Dublin working class, or the rural working class. And it just goes to show the arrogance that's always been there amongst a lot of the middle class liberals. Because it's acceptable to have a prejudice against a working class dub, or you can go on about the culties and how they're ignorant and parochial and stuff like that. And it's because they're not allowed to say anything pejorative about anybody else.
Yeah.
Because they'd have their friends kicking down on them and they'd face social isolation. So a lot of that I find in Ireland, and I've seen it in England, and I've spoken to friends of mine in England as well. There's a lot of that there. That basically, if you want to punch down on the white working class, because that's not only acceptable, it's laudable, because they're all gammon.
Yeah.
And they'll all vote UKIP or they'll all vote, and really what it is that it's just another form of snobbery.
Yeah.
It's always been there, but now it finds a lightning rod. And I do think what's interesting about Ireland is that we don't have a UKIP. Really, we don't have a Tommy Robinson figure. We don't have a Nigel Farage figure. And yet, per capita, I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but I remember seeing there was one bunch of figures that per capita, because Ireland's got such a small population, it's really been hit hard. And I think by and large, the Irish people have really behaved impeccably, and there's been a few incidents, and there always will be a few incidents. But my worry would be, I think we spoke after, I remember the December riots a couple of years ago on O'Connell Street.
Yeah.
And that all kind of kicked off. The problem is that when you keep people down and you refuse to allow them to ventilate their opinions, and if you just keep on saying, we're going to do you under hate speech legislation, or we're going to put you into social isolation and stuff like that, what happens then when you stifle debate? And that has happened in Ireland, and I've seen it quite a lot. People become resentful And they become more extreme in their opinions because if you keep on pushing somebody, eventually they're going to push back.
Yeah.
And it's a recipe for disaster. And I remember doing one debate, and it's about 500 people there or whatever, and a crowd had turned up and they just started chanting no free speech for Nazis at me. And I think they were furious when I just started laughing, and everybody else on the panel started laughing. I was like, listen, I've seen Nazis in Eastern Europe. Go to Hungary. You'll see some modern day Nazis. Trust me, love, I'm not a Nazi, but it's all you can do is kind of laugh, because sometimes the debate, and I'm sure I know from watching English current affairs programs and things like that, sometimes the debate is just so dull and stupid. And these are people who just look at the world as, a complete black and white cliche. And they've no room for nuance. They've no room for accepting that, sometimes there can be two sides to particular arguments. And I do think, I know this sounds very much like old man shouting at a cloud, but I do think as a society we're becoming dumber. And and as I said, like when I referenced that the old kids show Run Around, like people now, they jump into their box and that's it. They're in their box and they will never change their mind. Whereas I think that there's nothing better than changing your mind. When somebody comes up, when you present your argument and then somebody presents a better argument, that's brilliant, because you go, Jesus, I hadn't looked at it like that. That's a really good point. So like my ego isn't tied into my arguments, and the more information I have, and I'm sure you're the same, I'm sure most people are, but a lot of people aren't. And a lot of journalists aren't, and a lot of politicians aren't, and a lot of people who really should know better, because their job requires them to know better.
Yeah.
Whether it's the NGOs, journalists, civil servants, people like that. Again, it just goes back into, that Manichaean thing of you're either good or you're evil. And anybody who tries to introduce any kind of nuance to the debate gets shouted down, and frequently by both sides, which is something I always find amusing, Yeah. I mean, I've had it on a few occasions, and other friends, journalists and politicians that I get on quite well with, we kind of laughed at, you're doing the right job when you're being hated by both.
Yeah.
When you're annoying both.
I think that's, you make a really important point about the, if you don't allow people to express themselves, if you don't give people that democratic space that everyone should have a right to raise concerns, raise issues, without being shouted down, without being demonized, without being criminalized, then you do make the situation worse. And I think that's what we saw with the riots on O'Connell Street a couple of years ago. I referred to them as the fury of the cancelled, because I thought they were despicable riots. But if you put a lid on tensions, eventually they will blow. And the thing that I've noticed when I speak to the cultures out west is that this is the issue through which they most keenly experience their dislocation from political life and their dislocation from democratic life, because they wake up one morning, the local hotel is no longer accessible for a pint, which is the case in one of the towns I visit. There was a hotel there which is now fenced off. It's got immigrants in it, and you can't go in there for a roast dinner on a Sunday or a pint, which people used to do all the time. That's gone. They're told they're racist if they make any complaints about that. They're told that they shouldn't have access to the moral plane if they raise any issues at all about borders or migration. So it feels like it's the issue through which they've been disenfranchised, and people feel that really strongly. But you mentioned there the kind of growing cultural divide, and I did want to ask you about that, because I wanted to ask you how much you think class contributes to this, and you've touched on the question of class. But here in the UK, if you look at the protests at the hotel in Epping, for example, and now in Leeds and Nottinghamshire, people are protesting outside migrant hotels. The protesters are very often working class people, good people for the most part. Working class mums are making up a lot of these protests. The counter protesters who are there to defend the hotels tend to be from the graduate classes. They're often even quite posh. They read The Guardian, of course, all that kind of stuff. To what extent do you think this growing cultural divide maps onto a class divide? What do you think is going on with the entanglement of all of those different concerns?
Oh, it's hugely linked. It's the class divide that is really driven by a geographical divide.
Right. Yeah.
In the sense that it's the working class areas that are most great, and the rural working class areas that are most gravely impacted. There's no hotels in leafy Dublin 4, to use that old cliche, that have been turned into immigration centres, as far as I know. I'm open to correction, but I think we would have heard a lot more about that, because the locals there tend to have more political clout, because they're the accountants and the doctors and the barristers and the what's known as the Dublin 4 elite. So they have far more pull than somebody from, say, Crumlin, where I'm originally from, in Dublin 12. They don't know who their TD is. Most of them didn't go to university. It's a solid, good, strong working class area. And I'll give you a very quick, it's a slight digression, but I'll give you a very quick attitude or example of the attitude from the Irish media towards places like Crumlin. About 10 or 15 years ago, there was a big gang war going on in Crumlin between two rival drug gangs. There were bodies being dropped every week. We'd never really seen anything like it. It was very vicious, very nasty. I was only a young fella starting out in the Irish Independent, and the star feature writer, she was sent out to Crumlin to cover it. And I'd actually said, well, actually, I'm from Crumlin, and I know the families involved. And they went, no, she wants to do it. So, I was like, okay, fine. When you're new into a place, you don't want to step on any toes anyway. And she came back after spending an afternoon in Crumlin, and she sat down and very dramatically put her head in her hands, and she went, my God, it's no wonder they're killing each other. I was like, what? And she went, those conditions, it's no wonder. And I went, hang on a second, I'm from Kildare Road, which is one of the roads that's fairly central to the Crumlin feud. And I went, I grew up there. And I was fairly young, you know what I mean? And she was the chief, officially the chief features writer. That was her role. So the Queen Bee. And, but I kind of lost it.
Yeah.
And it was just like, how dare you talk about where I come from like that? So these people are not savages, And she just had that very, that very haughty kind of middle class thing where they just toss their hair and go, oh yeah, whatever,
Yeah.
And it was infuriating, And to think, what I've never forgiven her for, and a lot of this came out around the time of those gang feuds, and I'd find myself defending Crumlin and defending Drimnagh, because they were great places to grow up. And these tow rags had largely ruined it for everybody else who was still great and known as a solid working class community. And the amount of middle class, ignorant journalists who only ever drive through a working class area when they're on their way out to Dublin Airport, and they have to go through some of the north side suburbs, they were only too happy to accept that people from Crumlin were almost more genetically predisposed to killing each other than people from their graduate class were.
Yeah.
And it was bloody infuriating, to be honest with you. And then eventually you kind of have to laugh it off. But I mean, I was on a couple of Irish TV shows talking about this, going, like, you can't just demonise an entire class of people. You can't. It's like, this is outrageous. But they could, and they did. And they still do. Yeah. And you see it even with Conor McGregor.
Yeah.
Now, I can't stand McGregor. Right? Don't like him. I think he's come out with some awful nonsense in the past. I don't like the cheap parody of Irishness that he sells. But on the other hand, good luck to the lad. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't watch him fighting, but I don't lie awake at night giving out about him. But I've seen people from the mythical leafy Dublin 4, the middle class areas, which is predominantly who fills the journalistic classes. And they go, well, McGregor, Well, there's no surprise he's so much of a thug. He's from Crumlin. And I'm sitting there going,
Yeah.
I'm from Crumlin.
Yeah.
I haven't hit anybody since I left school. Like, they have this idea that we're all just kind of, mindless, tattooed apes going around punching or shooting each other. And one of the things that really struck me was the way the likes of Crumlin and Tala on the south side of Dublin, and the way, say, Finglas and Cabra on the north side of Dublin are portrayed by the Irish media is very much like how Punch magazine portrayed the Irish back in the 19th century. And everybody goes mad when they see those old Punch cartoons. You know, about the Irish being apes and monkeys and, uncivilized, filthy savages. A lot of the stuff I've seen in the Irish media in the last 10 to 15 years, when it's talking about Crumlin or Tala or Drimna or Artane or Finglas on the north side, it's just Punch. It really is just, it's like Punch magazine again. And nobody seems to care. It's really infuriating. It seems like there's nobody advocating for the working class of Dublin anymore. You know? Anyway, sorry, rant over. This is a topic that's just a bit close to my heart.
Oh, absolutely, and so it should be. But listening to you talk about Crumlin there and the Dublin, the media elite's attitude to it, it reminded me of the post-Brexit moment here in the UK, where suddenly all these journalists who'd never left London really, except to go to Italy perhaps, they had to go around the country to these places in Wales and up the north of England and try to find out why people voted for Brexit. And they were like exercises in anthropology more than journalism. They were studying these kind of far-flung tribes to try and work out what makes them tick. Just that extraordinary moral distance.
Yeah, they weren't going to darkest Africa, they were going to darkest Peckham.
Yeah. That's right. So I understand exactly what you're describing there. But it's the thing about Dublin that always strikes me. I usually just have flying visits to Dublin on my way to other parts of Ireland. But from what I know of it, I think people in Britain would be surprised at how stark the class divide is in Dublin. Maybe that's because it's a smaller city than London. London is an incredibly layered city. Of course, it's got a ruling class that looks down its nose at the plebs. That goes without saying. But it's also got layers and layers of different kinds of people who inhabit different classes and have different attitudes. So it's much bigger and I guess much broader. But in Dublin, it is often pretty stark. And you can walk through Dublin and almost instantly what kind of person you're dealing with. If you're dealing with someone who comes from a working class community, or if you're dealing with someone who's more of the snooty attitude that you've described. I mean, Dublin is quite, I guess the Dublin 4 elites are, I would say, as distant from ordinary Irish people as any establishment in Europe is distant from their people.
And they're proud of it. That's the thing, they're quite happy with that. And it's one of the things that, from the time I started out in journalism, and even before, it was one of the things that always fascinated me was that Dublin's a small city that's the capital of a small country. Right? We're very small. Yet the class divide in such a relatively small city, and that exists in Cork as well.
Yeah. You
could have two kids who live in an estate side by side, but one goes to a different school that plays rugby. Excuse me. The other goes to a different school that plays football, and they will go on and have entirely different lives, even though they grew up in the same postcode. But it's a very Irish thing because it's never spoken about, And I still get people saying to me, "What school did you go to?" But Jesus, it was 30 years ago. Who cares? And because that was an old thing that basically, if you went to a rugby playing school, you were seen as being, okay, maybe made of the right stuff. But if you went to a Gaelic football or I hate to use the word soccer, but to differentiate, a Gaelic football or a soccer school, you were automatically seen as being sort of working class and not necessarily to be trusted. And you see, the thing is, and you must have seen it, despite our protestations to the contrary, the Irish can be terribly snobby, and it can cut both ways as well, And I don't know whether that comes from our innate and hopefully rapidly dissipating sort of sense of insecurity, which has been undeniable throughout the history of the state. And also as well, and you kind of briefly touched on it earlier, it's like the Irish like having an argument. So we like having rows, we like insulting each other.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes done in a very jocular, friendly way, and sometimes not so. And it's funny, when the class thing comes up, it stops being jocular, funny. And it's so ridiculous. I mean, how can you possibly live 5 minutes away from somebody else and they're a different class to you? Dublin's too small for this nonsense.
Yeah.
You know, Cork is too small for this nonsense. You know, and because I'm Dublin, I mean, I'd look, and there's a Dublin working class and middle class divide, and there's a Cork working class and middle class divide, and everybody else is just coaches, and I don't care about them. You know, you just go, okay, well, you know, they're just rural types, you know.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. You know, the snobbery cuts always. I mean, there's inverse snobbery against Dublin as well. You know, in the countryside where my family is from, there's extreme hostility towards Dublin. The Jackeens of Dublin, as they refer to them, just as Dubliners would refer to them as culchies. I mean, these terms won't mean much to some listeners, but the divides in Ireland along the lines of class and culture and attitude are extraordinary. And another issue which I think expresses that and possibly deepens that divide is an issue that you and I have both written about over the past few months, which is Ireland's attitude towards Israel and the conflict between Israel and Hamas, because this is something that has actually horrified me quite a lot. You know, the attitude towards especially the Irish establishment and influential Irish people, or, you know, kind of middle classes, I guess, their attitude towards Israel, I think, is just incredibly hostile, bordering on bigoted very often. It's often referred to as the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. Certainly that's a view that's held by some Israeli officials. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on with that issue in Ireland and what you think it tells us about modern Ireland.
Well, I'll start with your last point first, if I may, about Ireland being widely seen throughout Israel, and not just Israel, also through other countries in Europe, of being the most anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli country, say, in the EU and Europe in general. The amount of Irish people who take that as a badge of honour and see that as a source of pride is horrifying. And this is one of the things, I mean, I think we've probably spoken before about how Ireland became hyper-politically correct when PC stuff came along, and people were very careful about what they'd say, and everybody had to, you know, yada, yada. But the one last socially acceptable form of racial discrimination or national discrimination is when you see people saying, oh, I don't hate Jews, I just hate the Israelis. And you're going, okay, you hate Jews, then just say it. Just come out and say it. I mean, and this is the thing, is like, I mean, you know, the old Irish phrase, oh, that such and such a person can talk out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. And they're saying mutually contradictory things. But the funny thing is, and this is something I've never been able to understand, is all the rows I've had with people over Israel, because I'm an unapologetic and staunch supporter of Israel. I think it's the front line in a war that we could all be fighting in a few decades' time. But apart from that, apart from all the politics and blah blah blah, I just bloody love the place. I love the weather. I love the people. I love the food. I love their sense of humour, and I love the crack. Right, you know, but it's almost as if, now we can parse the words. You can say anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic, and people get pissed off when they're accused of being anti-Semitic, and they go, "No, I'm just anti-Israeli." So even if we give them that consideration, and we say, "Okay, well, you're just being racist against Israelis, then you're not being racist against Jews," they don't get offended as much as if you'd said, "Well, you're being racist against blacks, or you're being racist against, you know, Hispanics or something." And I remember there's a friend of mine, he's a journalist. Now, obviously, I won't mention his name because that wouldn't be fair. But, well, when I say he was a friend, is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because I don't talk to him anymore, because we had one conversation where he actually terrified me. about his views, and he's gay. We were having a beer one night, and he was giving out about the latest Israeli atrocity that turns out wasn't an atrocity at all. And he then started talking about his boyfriend, who he'd been living with for about 5 years, and he was sort of, giving out about the boyfriend, the usual kind of, just bitching. And I said to him, well, you do realise that, you wouldn't have that problem if you lived in Gaza. And he went, what do you mean? I said, well, because both these would be killed. So that'd sort that story. And he came out with, Brennan, the weirdest thing I've ever seen. He said, maybe, but at least they're not as bad as the fucking Jews. And I go,
wow.
What? Like, the people who you admit might try to kill you in certain circumstances, but at least they're not as bad as the effing Jews.
Yeah.
Now, don't tell me that's a problem with Israeli policy in the West Bank, right? Don't try and say this is a problem with the Likud party. Don't try and say this has anything to do with Israelis' domestic politics and how they treat Palestinian Israelis. Park that bus and blow it up. Take it out, right? Because what I saw from this guy was out and out Jew hatred.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with the politics. And at least they're not effing Jews. It was like, and I remember just laughed and I shook his hand and I went, thanks, man.
Yeah.
And he went, why? I said, because I always suspected it, but now you've shown it to me. And we don't actually interact anymore because as fond of him as I was, there comes a line where I wouldn't hang around with somebody who supports the KKK. Just wouldn't, And I don't particularly want to hang around with somebody who refers to the effing Jews.
Yeah.
And it's like, but it's so 1950s Ireland. I had a grandfather and he was a civil servant and very bright guy. I used to read his books in old Irish, the old Celtic thing, and he'd write all his letters and that. And he worked in Dublin Castle, which is the epicenter of the Irish civil service and stuff. And he hated, and during the 40s himself and some Irish civil servants went to the German embassy when it was still open, and they volunteered to go over and fight for Germany. And the secretary, or the first person that they met, just kind of laughed and said, yeah, on your way, go away, silly paddies. But that attitude still exists. And I've spent years writing about this. And I spent years trying to interrogate the issue. And I spent years talking to Irish Jews, talking to Israeli Jews in the embassy, going over to Israel, which I love. I can't wait to go back over, actually. And I still can't get my head around why so many liberals in Ireland, or people who have the audacity to refer to themselves as liberals, why they have this visceral hatred for the only liberal country in the region.
Yeah.
It's just, I genuinely, it'll take a greater mind than mine and it's one of the things that some other journalists who would be fairly pro-Israeli, we've often sat down and spoken about it, and we go, what is the Irish problem with the Jews? Genuinely. What is it? And the barometer that I have is when you're having, not even necessarily an argument, just when you're having a discussion with bright, liberal, as I said, the guy who said, at least they're not as bad as the fucking Jews. I mean, he was gay. Like, thrown from the tallest building. That's what you call suicidal empathy. But when you're talking to these people, you go, this is because it's the last acceptable hatred.
Yeah.
And without wanting to sound like a deep South American preacher, they have hatred in their hearts.
Yeah.
But they can't direct it.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, hating on Israelis is an acceptable thing. And they always make a point of saying Israel or Israelis. But then they get a couple of drinks in or they get really annoyed. And it goes from being the Israelis to the fucking Jews.
Yeah.
And my friend who I had that row with, I mean, he's gay. And I was always honoured that I was one of the first people that he came out to about 20 odd years ago. And I was saying to him, I said, you'd love the gay beach in Tel Aviv. It's better than the beach in Miami. You'd love, Tel Aviv is a town that's made for you. No, I'd never go there. I'd never go there. And you kind of, if he goes 100 miles down the road, they'd kill him. And they're the people he supports.
Yeah.
And he's not just a one-off. He's an exemplar of a certain type of Irish liberal. He's very liberal on other issues, and it's not just Ireland. I mean, I see it in England, and I see it in a more kind of demented way in America. But they have all the right views on everything, all the acceptable views, but then when it comes to Israel, it's like all bets are off. I still can't get my head around some good friends of mine who were good friends, and we stuck together through thick and thin down the years, and they completely shunned me.
Yeah.
Because I was one of the few journalists.
It is that kind of, people refer to it as suicidal empathy, or a kind of that suicidal alliance between supposed liberals in the West and then movements like Hamas and others who they have this enormous sympathy for, which is ridiculous. But like you, I just don't buy the anti-Zionism argument anymore, because I just think anti-Zionism is the new form of anti-Semitism. Because what you essentially have now, including in Ireland, in fact, especially in certain circles in Ireland, you have people saying, I don't hate the Jews, I just hate Jewish nationhood, the Jewish homeland, the Jewish army, and every Jew in the West who supports that. That's essentially what they're saying. Yeah. So they basically are saying they hate Jews, but in a way that they think is acceptable. And in relation to why, I get the same question as well. What is Ireland's problem? And I do struggle to answer it, because it is, I think, complicated and weird and disquieting and upsetting to see it happen in Ireland. But if you look at, I did want to ask you about kneecap, in fact, because neither you and I are fans of kneecap. People will say that's because we're old men who don't understand them, but I think it's because they're not very good. So kneecap has become incredibly popular amongst certain constituencies in the UK and other parts of Europe and in the US, in large part because they've brought this message from Ireland around the world. And what they say, which is such a cack-handed argument, they say, well, we're Irish, we were oppressed for 800 years, so we know what the Palestinians are going through. That's always the argument that comes out, that the Irish understand the Palestinians because you're the same thing. What's your response when you hear kneecap and others make that case?
Well, that's an argument that's only used by those who suffer from the hard of thinking. You can demolish that argument very, very quickly. And you could just imagine somebody just, taking a big slug of his pint, a bit like you there, and going, sure, didn't the Irish suffer as well, And they have this, I think, crucially, whether they realise it or not, but because even before their time, a lot of the way the debate was framed by academics and the media in Ireland was that Israel was analogous to Britain and the Palestinians were analogous to the Irish. So that then managed to gain a foothold that, while even today that's no longer openly acknowledged, it's embedded itself in the discourse. And this is one of the things I find. I used to get annoyed by it, but now I just laugh, is that young, bright Western liberals, and I mean, I read one pro-Palestinian march, there was a Gays for Palestine banner. I just thought, is this somebody shitposting? Is there a bunch of lads actually going and taking the mickey out of them? But no, Gays for Palestine. You just kind of see a situation where people just take the easy position rather than, because, and don't forget as well, Israel is saying, anybody who doesn't like Israel will also say that they hate America. And America is the great Satan.
Yeah.
So Israel is just seen as being the little Satan. But the two of them together are synonymous with, capitalism and evil and all the cliches and all the bugbears. But there's always hope. And there was a friend of mine who worked in the Evening Herald. We're on the same newsroom floor. And we go to the same pub for a pint after work and stuff. And he was very pro-Palestinian. and very anti-Israeli. And he used to say things like, well, you know that Palestinians aren't allowed to get into a car with an Israeli if they're working in Tel Aviv. And I was going, John, that's just nonsense. Like, it's just, because I went through, like, I've been to Israel a fair amount of times, and I love Tel Aviv. I can't recommend Tel Aviv highly enough for anybody, So in fairness to John, I said, you're talking through your hoop. You haven't a clue. I said, come over. We'll go over for a week. And I'll show you. I'll show you Tel Aviv. I'll show you Jaffa. I'll show you, various different. We'll go up to Haifa and stuff. And so, in fairness to him, he had the open mindedness. He went, okay. But I was like, the moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen, is that he's now living in Tel Aviv, married to an Israeli girl, and he fell in love when he was over there. And he didn't just fall in love with the girl. He fell in love with the people. He fell in love with the country and he realised. I remember we were out one night, and he went, "Everything I've been told is wrong." Mm. And I went, "Yeah, and you're a journalist, so imagine how the others feel." But he went, "I've been told shit by other journalists, and it's complete nonsense." I was like, "Yes, now the scales are dropping from your eyes. Go out and make up your own mind and fine." But the thing is, it's much easier and it's much more profitable in Ireland to tell a lie about Israel than it is to tell the truth. Yeah. You'll go further and you'll get more bookings on radio and TV, and you'll get more op-eds if you're telling lies or demonizing Israel than you will if you're trying to stand up and just speak the truth. Like, again, I've had journalists and the Palestinian workers in Tel Aviv aren't allowed to get into a car with an Israeli, and they have to. You just go, that's just nonsense. Yeah. And the only reassuring aspect of that is if you're reduced to making up such arrant bullshit, well, then there's a part of your brain that must know it's arrant bullshit. Mm. So maybe at some stage you might be open to kind of persuasion. But what I always loved about John was very pro-Palestinian. He always made a point of saying that he wasn't anti-Israeli, he was pro-Palestinian. Mm. And he never talked about the Jews, it was the Israelis, so, and he was a fair man, a good man. He wasn't an anti-Semite by any means, but he was very anti-Israeli policies. We went over, we spent a week there. He came back with me and then spent a week in Dublin, getting his affairs in order, and then went back to Tel Aviv, and he's been there ever since. And I always admired that about him. He was somebody who would have been, the whole reason for our trip was me to show him that it wasn't the sort of fascist hellscape that he thought it was. But he was representative in his first reflexive anti-Israeli position. He was very representative of a lot of Irish people, a lot of Irish media, and the so-called intelligentsia, where he wasn't representative in the least. And this is what I admired the most about John, was that when he saw the reality, he completely changed his mind. Mm. And he went, wow, I've been fed a lie for 20 years. Yeah. And as I said, he's now running his own business in Tel Aviv. And you have to admire somebody who can just kind of go, yeah, got that one, called that one really badly wrong. Yeah. Actually, this place is great.
Yeah, the amount of misinformation on Israel, not only on Israel generally, but on the current war in particular, is extraordinary. I think it's the war that's currently taking place between Israel and Hamas. I think it's the most lied about war of my lifetime. I mean, the misinformation every day especially from the kind of broadsheet press, the state media, is just extraordinary. But just one more question on the Israel thing is, you mentioned earlier, Ireland's tradition or habit of superstition and that kind of yearning for good and evil, putting people in their runaround boxes. And you say that they did that on the migrant issue. And I think it's also, you could see that on the trans issue and other things as well, where you define your moral decency and your virtue through taking a very fixed position and demonizing everyone else. I mean, that seems to me to be the case with Israel in particular. And when I was in Ireland last, it seems, you mentioned there that Israel as the little Satan. It does seem that in Ireland, Israel has become almost like a Satan substitute in a post-Catholic country. It's the means through which that's evil, and if you oppose it, you're good. To what extent do you think all these problems that we're talking about in Ireland spring from I don't know, a kind of moral vacuum or a post-religious vacuum, or just a country looking for a sense of purpose and then kind of latching on to these different issues through which the elite then define themselves through?
Well, that's a really interesting point, because name drop alert. I spent a lot of time talking to Christopher Hitchens about this. He was fascinated by the Irish shift from overt religiosity into what he saw as the same thing, just wearing different clothes. You know, and that it's still, we're people who like orthodoxy and who like certain things. We like certitude.
Yeah.
You know, and but one of the things, for example, when you mentioned the religion stuff, is that I'm an atheist. I always was. You know, I just never believed. Didn't have any problem with it. Didn't lie awake at night fulminating against the Catholic Church or against people, you know, who get comfort out of it. And I remember actually once when they were talking about bringing in a blasphemy bill, going to the Atheist Ireland, had a bunch of speakers and they asked me to talk at it. And one of the things I found really depressing was the amount of people who were there who were sneering at Catholics. And I remember saying, look, I mean, the church gave my grandmother huge comfort when her husband died. You know, the church can be, you know, has been a great force for good as well as a great force for evil. You know, you have to kind of, you know, you can't just take one with the other. But again, it goes into that we were probably, if not certainly one of the strictest Catholic countries in Europe. And the difference I'd always have with that is that people say, oh, what about Spain and what about Italy? Well, the Spanish and the Italians always loved sex.
Yeah.
They didn't sneer at it and look down at it. And if you want to look at the difference between Irish Catholicism and Spanish or Italian Catholicism, there's one word: sex.
Yeah.
Spanish and the Italians were never afraid of it. We were. So we got basically a Protestant Catholicism, where we got all the bad bits from both. But now it seems in the last generation, people have swapped one orthodoxy for the next. And some of the most ardent atheists and atheist campaigners that I know, and as I said, I mean, I've spoken at Atheist Ireland meetings and stuff like that, and I've never been religious. But I look at some of these and they seem to have the same psychological profile as a fire and brimstone redemptorist preacher would have 100 years ago, in the sense that it's that same Manichaean black and white kind of thing, you know, in the same way that the Irish redemptorist order, they were famous for their blood and thunder speeches, and you're all going to hell, and they go on for 3 hours. And anybody who didn't agree with them was doomed to hellfire. And it's not all of them, but some of the atheists, particularly the activists, they have exactly the same degree of certitude and moral certainty. And it was only when I did a couple of the public meetings, when with some of the most devout atheists, as I not complimentarily call them, 30 or 40 years ago, they would have been a priest.
Yeah.
They're just people who like telling people what to do. And they're people who like scolding other people. Whereas the least important thing to me is the fact that I don't believe in God. Like, why on earth would that be a defining part of my life? Like, it's just, you know, and I don't believe in the Easter Bunny either. It doesn't mean I have to form an organisation going, you know, the Easter Bunny. And yet, but for a lot, not all, that would be very unfair, but for a lot of the atheists, their lack of religion is important to them as religion is to very religious people.
Yeah.
And both sides have far more in common than they would ever like to admit. And both sides, the one thing that they really have in common is when they look at the others, they look at them with a degree of sort of smug moral superiority. You know, that they're not all the atheists, I stress that, not all of them, but some of them, and some of the most vociferous campaigners, they look on religious people, any religious person, as a bit stupid, a bit thick, and gullible. And they call them sheeple. You know that awful phrase, sheeple.
Yeah.
And then you get some of the, some of the other religious people go, "Oh, you're going to hell," but there aren't that many of them. You know what I mean? And by and large, and this is weird coming from an Irish man who's from an Irish Catholic background. Although, like, obviously, I'm not Catholic anymore. I don't think I ever really was. But I have more interesting engagements and debates with a lot of Irish Catholics to this day than I do with some of the Irish atheists, because some of the atheists are more doctrinaire than any Vatican I or Vatican II Catholic, you know. And I just go, ultimately as well, you kind of have the capacity at some point to go, I'm tapping out of this debate. This has just got too silly, you know. And I'm not going to judge somebody on whatever God that they believe in, because I don't believe in any. But that, you know, whatever gets. Here's the thing: my fundamental philosophy is whatever gets you through the night. You do your stuff. You leave me alone to do my stuff, and then we'd all rubble on very nicely. And I see some Catholics sort of trying to interfere with others. Not as much anymore, because the Catholic Church is finished in this country. Had its day, and it's a good thing that it is finished. But what I don't like is seeing people pissing on the corpse of the Catholic Church and laughing as they do so, when they were the ones who kept their mouths shut when having a go at the church or raising any objections would have had personal or career consequences. Yeah. So it's like, oh, okay, now you're gonna run with the hands now. You know, where were you when I mattered? You know, and a lot of brave Irish people, their careers were pretty much ruined back in the 50s and 60s. You know, and those people are heroes because they went in and they stated their case, they stood their ground, they made their point, knowing that there would be consequences, knowing that they could find themselves out of a job and out of a career, and shunned and slammed from the pulpit in their own parish church, which happened to numerous authors and stuff. So when I see it now, I mean, I just look at Catholicism, I look at the church, it's something that in this country did a lot of good, it did a lot of damage, but it was part of who we were. It's still part of who some people are. And it's a very important part for them. And good luck to them. But I really have a bigger issue with the intolerant atheists. Yeah. Who just kind of sneer. Yeah. And in a way that they would never sneer at Muslims.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've had the exact same experience where I just find I'm also an atheist, and I've found those new atheists, that kind of muscular secularism, to be pretty off-putting especially in the 2000s when it was incredibly popular. And I think you're right to talk about scolding. You know, the new scolds are no longer the priests or the nuns who've run out of power, essentially, but, you know, the woke and the Israelophobes and the trans lobby and all those kinds of new churches that have taken over. Okay, Ian, my last question for you before we run out of time is just about future prospects for Ireland. Pretty broad. You mentioned earlier that Ireland doesn't have a Reform Party, it doesn't have a Nigel Farage figure, it doesn't have a Trump figure. It seems to me that the prospects for populism in Ireland are fairly limited at the moment. Politics there seems spectacularly uninspiring, both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and the other smaller parties too, and Sinn Féin, who I think are dull. So what are the prospects? Is something new going to cut through? Will something change? Is Conor McGregor going to become president? Is there any prospect for a shake-up in the Irish political system, do you think?
I'll give you the short answer first. The short answer is no.
Right.
I'll give you the slightly longer answer now. Even the most liberal Irish person tends to be quite conservative in their outlooks, and they don't like changing things. And most Irish people are conservative with a small c, even though politically they might not see themselves like that. But ultimately, really, that's what we are. And I find with a lot of the fringe parties on the left, a lot of them just come across as mad. They're as mad as some of the fringe parties on the right, you know. And we have, and I love looking at the smaller parties in Ireland as a sort of a weird anthropological experiment for, you know, various different tribes that have just been found down in darkest Connemara or something, and nobody's ever explored their theoretical landscapes before. And But the thing is, Ireland is not an extreme country. We will veer from soft left to centre right. It's why we tend to have coalitions.
Yeah.
It's the politics of consensus and kind of working things out, which when I was in my 20s and 30s used to drive me mad. Because, and then you get a bit older and you go, oh, actually, this kind of makes sense. But what I find is there's very little daylight between Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, a bit more with Labour. And ultimately, that's because that's what the people want. Mm. Because if there was a desperate desire for something else, Sinn Féin, for example, who always hoped that they would really capitalise on the protest vote, well, why aren't Sinn Féin in power? Because ultimately the Irish are fairly conservative. We like having a protest. We like having a moan. We like giving out. But we don't want to rock the boat too abruptly. We don't want to, kick everything over. We don't want to torch things. And so I think that's pretty why we're good arguers of things, because we tend to talk rather than do, which can be both a strength and a weakness. But we don't lend ourselves to extremism. And even if you look at parties across Europe, the rise of the anti-immigrant parties, in some of them, we've one small one here, the Irish Freedom Party, and they're just seen as a joke. And this is actually one of the things I like about the Irish approach to politics, is when the likes of the Freedom Party came along, and they'd have their little paramilitary marches and all this kind of stuff. Rather than being horrified, oh my God, what's happening to this country? Or rather than being angry, saying, we're letting fascists in, people just laughed. And it was just like, yeah, whatever, go away, We're a country that will wildly veer between moderate centre left and moderate centre right. They're about as extreme as the extremes get. Mm. And I think the vast majority of people are happy with that. We're still a fairly calm and easygoing people. We get annoyed, give out about the government and stuff like that. But there's no room. Not even that there's no room. Even during the massive rise in immigration, and where tensions over immigration comes from is always, in every country, it's to do with housing and to do with how the redistribution of resources, right? Housing, school places, things like that. Now, that's obviously had an impact on particularly the working class areas of Dublin and stuff like that. But by and large, the Irish are fairly easy going, You'll always get a couple of cranks, and social media has probably amplified them beyond their ability or their but no, it's the one thing that I do like about Ireland, and it used to drive me mad when I was younger. It was kind of like, why aren't we more angry? Why aren't we more angry? We need to get angry about this. And then you kind of get older, and you see that people who are now my age, when I was 22, looking at people my age, I was going, you're so complacent, and you're not getting. Like, I was in Conley Youth, which is the Communist Party of Ireland's youth party, and you have your own idealistic left-wing past.
Yeah,
and I'm proud of it. I would never deny it, because it was coming from the right place. It was coming from a very idealistic place. But now I'm more of a pragmatist than an idealist, and I think that's I hate to use the word journey, right? But I think that's a journey a lot of us kind of go on. When you're in your late teens, early 20s, you want to burn the world, and when you get into your 40s, you're like, that seems like a lot of hassle. I just want an easy life, and I want sensible people in charge who won't do mad things.
Ian, thank you very much.